It is now 3 o'clock, and I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you so much for attending this session. This panel is entitled "The Fear of Black Consciousness," and just to uh, and we have 4 panelists today, and I will, um, allow each person to introduce themselves however way they wish to as their time comes up. But let me just give a brief synopsis of all of us. This proposed panel entails an interdisciplinary approach towards addressing the common theme of the fear of Black consciousness, from ranging from the decline of the Black arts movements from 65 to 75 and its diminished legacy, functions as a form of cultural banditry, meaning theft, with long-term implications. Also, anti-DEI laws and practices contain retrogressive aims using racially coded language. The deconstruction of critical race theory, accompanied with the stigmatization of African American language, aims to devalue Black linguistic capital. Furthermore, using sacred religious texts drawing from African American biblical hermeneutics, the concept of the quote unquote white gaze combined with the historical critical method normalizes existential threats to physical Black bodies in the present through its ability to shape perception. And the panelists, all 4 of us, in a different way, present 4 different institutions: aesthetics, politics, education, and religion, and how they have endured attacks for confronting some aspect of the social order out of a common fear. So I will begin with mine. Is we'll deal with the opposition to the Black arts movement. The Black arts movement, in shorts, roughly from 1965 to 1975, it aimed to raise Black consciousness. It posed a threat to the social order in the United States and even beyond, specifically in terms of race relations. From this social movement came various forms of performing and literary arts that expressed the message of racial solidarity and self-determination in explicit terms, using the Black vernacular unapologetically as an extension of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. It infused art with activism, with an emphasis on promoting Black nationalism and its different forms while redefining Black identity and expression. However, such artists and activists face significant risk for refraining from rhetorical respectability, which resulted in surveillance from federal agencies due to being targeted as a national security threat. And such forms of opposition remained relevant into the 21st century through practices such as book banning, truncated curriculums in public education from kindergarten through higher ed, attacks on academic freedom, limitations to creative control, and thus impacting human behavior through controlling ideas and information. So the FBI has its purpose, self-proclaimed purpose is to safeguard national security and to uphold the United States Constitution and to protect the American people. However, the Black arts movement, as a sister to the Black Power movement, exposed the agency's contradictory practices in the form of differential justice. From the agency came COINTELPRO, which actually, ironically, 1956 of all years, the Montgomery bus boycott year, from 1956 to 1971, which is almost a generation, not quite, with the proclaimed objective to disrupt Communist Party activities in the United States and discredit any form of collective behavior that the FBI considered as subversive. Among the target groups included affiliates of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, in addition to writers and artists. And COINTELPRO tactics included the use of propaganda for character assassination purposes, instigating internal dissent through spreading rumors, of course, surveillance on top of surveillance, and arrest. And this was the context and the condition in which the Black arts movement existed. So anytime we, hindsights, check out, observe, listen to, or consume literature, or even moved in or anything, poems and essays and literature, or even music that came from that era, depending on who it was, it existed under this context. Now, phenomenologist Gary T. Marx, not to be confused with Karl Marx, just happen to have the same name, but phenomenologist Gary T. Marx, he distinguished acts of repression according to their purpose as creating an unfavorable image of opponents, gathering information, restricting the flow of resources for movements, discouraging activists, fueling internal conflicts within the leadership and between groups, and sabotaging specific actions. So thus, the actions of COINTELPRO aligned with this person's description of how federal resources were used against literary and performing artists, including those who wrote plays and poems and essays that critiqued the social order, as it exposed corruption or suggested the existence of systemic racism in vivid and concrete terms. Let me pause for a second. Dr. Johnson, can you share that what I sent you? If not, don't worry about it. Oh, I can't even hear you.
Do you want to share it? You can share if you got it.
Okay. Oh man. Okay. I'll pass. I just want to don't want to lose any time.
I got let me see, because I'm not on my computer here. So
okay.
Yeah.
So while this is coming up, let me just kind of explain what's being shared. All right. So in the case of James Baldwin, who is the author of many books, many literature, many speeches. Thank you so much. Yeah, you can leave it all up there. Thank you. In the case of James Baldwin, author of two major titles that come to mind immediately is Go Tell It on the Mountain. That's one of his earlier works. The Fire Next Time, which is somewhere in the middle, early 60s compilation, which, technically they predate the prescribed dates of the Black Arts Movement, but they were still part of the movement, and not just the writings, but also as an activist. Among other classics, they exceeded all other literary artists and political activists in terms of having an FBI file of over 1,800 plus pages. Let me park right there for a minute. So that image that you're looking at, of all artists, writers, playwriters, people who wrote poems and essays, James Baldwin ranks number one as far as the length of FBI files. A couple of decades of data was collected on Baldwin. So here's the issue here. His writings, his speaking engagements, and his private phone conversations were all under surveillance, with the claim that he posed a threat to national security, without mentioning his ability to inspire Black consciousness. Now, the FBI eventually closed Baldwin's case file by the year 1973, but by then the damage was already done. Now, let's just go on to that next slide real quick. Now, the reason why I chose James Baldwin, I'll just tell you who the next few are: The Last Poets, and then Katherine Dunham. Just choosing artists from different genres. All right, so Baldwin, a novelist. The Last Poets, you got a combination of poetry and music and that genre. And then later on, we'll get to Katherine Dunham, who was in dance. All right, so now in the case of The Last Poets, this was before there was rap music, the last poets were among some of the groups and artists that were classified, maybe might we say proto-rap. Well, anyway, they deliberately formed on May 19th, 1968, on the very next anniversary of Malcolm X's birthday that followed the assassination of MLK Jr. And they were also monitored by COINTELPRO as artists who faced federal surveillance and multiple arrests. For example, in the year 1969, Omar Ben Hassan, one of the poets, he is in that picture on the left. He is the guy wearing the black top and the blue trousers or the blue pants. So that's Omar Ben Hassan. I think of those four people that you see in the picture, I think he's the only one that's still living right now. Yes, but anyway, him. One of the most controversial songs on that very first album, which is to the left, was the N-word, plural, are scared of revolution. Recorded and at least released in 1970. Well, anyway, he wrote those words in 1969, which appeared on their self-titled debut studio recording in response to a private conversation where he was asked, "What have you learned since you've been in Harlem?" And that was the context in which his words wrote, in which the roads to end are scared of revolution. Now, in response to that, the group was placed on the FBI watch list. Then we have the words to E pluribus unum, which is now found on that third one, chastisements, found on, which explicitly critiques what sociologists, or at least sociological theorists, C. Wright Mills referred to as the power elite. The power elite, in fact, you have a picture of the image of the book, The Power Elite, right there. And thank you so much. And, this is roughly, like, say, 1953. My years may be off by a year or two, so pardon me on that one. But in other words, this, so the words to E pluribus unum found on chastisement, it critiques what C. Wright Mills referred to as the power elite through a creative interpretation of the meaning of the US dollar bill to address the executive order, to address the executive office, symbolized on top with the picture of the White House. Below there, the military leaders, which is at the bottom, in the middle, symbolized with the picture of the Pentagon, and also the executive elite symbolized with Wall Street. And ironically, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech, not a sermon, but a speech. Now, a lot of the sermons following that borrowed from that speech, but he gave a speech entitled "The Three Evils of Society." 3 years later, 1967. And those three evils of society corresponds with the power elite, corresponds with what the last poets talked about in that song. So during this time, King was openly evolving ideologically as one who was subject to FBI surveillance. In his speech, he identified the three evils as racism, which corresponds to the executive elite. Let me park there for a minute. Which have historically, now the executive office have historically been beholden to hegemonic powers such that office holders themselves may not necessarily even be racist, at least inwardly, in their beliefs. Yet, they feel compelled to return favors to racists who empowered them and as their duty. A whole nother different speech altogether. But anyway, now, then we have Robert Merton, who had a term for which he called reluctant liberals, which describes how individuals and institutions succumb to bigotry due to external pressure. So now the second evil, excessive materialism, corresponds to C. Wright Mills's corporate elite. You see the image Wall Street at the bottom. And King was cautious with his rhetoric by making excessive materialism as his word of choice rather than overtly calling capitalism an evil. They would have been very dangerous to call capitalism an evil in 67. We see it is today, but if you call capitalism an evil in 67, they were still dealing with what you call the prolongation of the Red Scare of the 1920s, the prolongation of McCarthyism in the 50s, and that would have provoked the FBI to step up their antics and tie King to communism when he was really actually addressing the use of federal resources for poverty relief across racial boundaries. And then the third evil was militarism. You can see right there, the Pentagon in the middle, which corresponds with the military elite and also the Vietnam War and the Cold War, and now in the 21st century, many wars and proxy wars. And so now let's just go to the very last one. I just want to wrap up now because I'm about a minute over already. And we've got Catherine Dunham. Catherine Dunham predates the Black Arts movements, but yet she became relevant to the movement as she responded to the urban uprisings and poverty amid affluence by opening something called the Performing Arts Training Center. And one of the things that Dunham did was she meddled, and it had already been tested a few days after the July of 67 rebellion. Now, there were a lot of rebellions between the mid 60s to the early 70s. So this one here is specifically talking about East St. Louis. And she herself was arrested. Now, what was she arrested for? She was arrested for going to the aid of a young Black Power spokesperson on behalf of, the East St. Louis war-torn corners. And so, of course, the rebellion and Joe's death and funeral, of course, it fueled the writing and the staging of the quote unquote, the ode to Taylor Jones, the activist. Now, although dance may seem apolitical on the surface, I'm about to wrap this up. Dance may seem apolitical at the surface, but in this particular case, it functioned as a means of bringing unity to a torn community, and thus bringing unity, or even an attempt to. It always functions as an antidote to one of the initial objectives of COINTELPRO or other similar organized efforts, which is to sow discord among a population. The control of any social movements, and also, so I'll go ahead and stop right there because I'm over time. So thank you very much, everybody.
All right. Who do you have next, Michael?
Okay, so now we have next is Cody Jackson, and I'm gonna allow Cody to introduce himself.
All right.
Sounds great. Thank you, Michael. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, talk up just a little.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I'll try my best. Hello. Yes, so thank you, Michael, for that really interesting history of Black social movements and how they sort of shape culture. I find topics like that incredibly interesting, and I think is quite relevant to what I'm presenting today. And I hope that for those who've had a chance to read what I submitted, or even if you haven't, I hope that this sort of early work that I'm sort of developing hopefully generates interest, generates ideas, generates questions, and I'm incredibly open to sort of any comments, thoughts, questions that anyone has about the project. Like I said, it's in sort of early stages as I'm sort of theorizing the question. But to start us off, I want to ask everyone to sort of engage in an exercise with me. If we could all sort of close our eyes, and I want you to imagine a CEO. What does a CEO look like? What are they wearing? How do they speak? More often than not, typically, people tend to vision this person as, middle-aged, white, male, that sort of speaks in this sort of, corporate jargon of, circling back, and we'll table that idea for now. But what I'm really interested in is sort of, it's not necessarily about who we picture, but more so how that image how was that image built? And what work does that image do in sort of the popular consciousness of society? Um, and I think that to me is what's really, really important about kind of this larger question that I'm sort of wrestling with as we sort of see in popular political discourse and we see in current events of this sort of massive anti-DEI movement that we have sort of seen arisen after 2020 when large DEI initiatives sort of started to become commonplace across the corporate sphere, across organizations in general. And since then, we sort of see this massive sort of right-wing backslide, this sort of backlash of sort of anti-DEI sentiment. And while I think there are many incredible and important scholars that sort of are very correct to point out sort of the root sort of anti-Black racism that's sort of embedded in this movement. But I think that for me in particular, what I'm really interested in is like, what is the logic of anti-DEI? What is it about sort of a society that sort of is built on white supremacist and sort of patriarchal norms that creates this idea that an organization that has, say, like a Black woman as its CEO is sort of in their minds problematic? What is the logic that they're really operating under? And that's kind of what this study is really trying to get at. And so to start, I kind of want to talk about like what organizations really are and how they're sort of formulated within sort of the sociological literature. I'm a sociologist by training. I'm a current third year graduate student. And so a lot of the literature within sociology and how they sort of talk about organizations is they really tend to focus on organizations in 2 to 3 different ways. They really focus on organizations as the sort of internal structures with different groups sort of interacting with each other to produce something. It's sort of like seen as this mass collaborative project. So that's one way organizations are understood. Another way that they're understood is sort of as these sort of marketers, right? They try to market themselves and their mission and what they are producing to society in general. And because of that, because of this marketing angle, they're sort of projecting out to the rest of the world. What I'm interested in that I think is largely understudied within the sociological literature of organizations is how does society understand organizations, right? This sort of inverse of like how are the norms of society sort of implanting themselves within an organizational structure, regardless of what it is, right? This can be an organization that's, maybe a corporate business. It could be, think of a professional sports team, think of even a community organization. How do sort of larger societal norms sort of influence the actual built structure of an organization? And what can that sort of tell us about this sort of anti-DEI backlash that we find? And so what I'm really theorizing in this paper is trying to make sense of organizations within two large theoretical spheres. So one is I'm arguing that organizations are sort of built like living bodies, right? They sort of have characteristics, have subgroups within an organization that sort of mimic human anatomy, right? And so you think about the people who are in charge of the direction of the organization, who strategize, the sort of decision makers, they sort of sit at the top as the mind, right? They're the mind of the organization. Then you have sort of people who are the limbs, people who actually do the manual service labor that interact with the world in the way that a body's hands would, right? And then you have like, internal organs, people within the organization that are focused on, keeping the organization afloat, the general health. Think of like HR departments are examples of this. And so on and so forth. There's also, I think more critically, just like the actual physical like feet of an organization, parts of the organization that actually keep the entire organization standing, right? The feet, the very bottom. These are people that are quite literally physically propping the entire organization up, that tend to have the hardest jobs, that tend to do the most difficult labor, but also are rewarded the least. And this sort of anatomy of an organization, I think, is a really helpful metaphor for thinking about this, or at least helping understand this sort of like anti-DEI sort of swing that we're seeing in the country, which is sort of attacking the very idea that certain individuals who are stereotyped based on their labor. So think of black bodies as people who are fit for physical work, right? These are people who are for history, right? Black people, we've sort of been painted as physical laborers. Our job is to labor. So roles that we see black people tend to be articulated into in organizations tend to be ones within the limbs or in the feet, right? White men are kind of seen as these sort of decision makers. These are the thinkers, right? These are the people that make the hard choices. These men tend to be the CEOs that exist in the mind of an organization. But labor is also gendered in an interesting way, right? Like the invisible work that women do within an organization, think of like HR departments, these tend to predominantly be women because they are sort of doing the invisible busy work that the men sort of don't want to do, that are not necessarily rewarded but are incredibly vital to the organization itself. And this to me really explains the sort of anti-DEI movement that we're seeing, because it's in the mind of someone who has sort of normalized the white supremacist and patriarchal sort of idea of what an organization is and how it ought to be. Sees, for example, they'll see like a black woman in the C-suite as a CEO, and for them, it's a direct violation of what an organization ought to be. And so, in many ways, like affirmative action and DEI is actually a direct challenge to this sort of historical understanding of what an organization is supposed to be based on how labor is stereotyped, who belongs in what limb of the organization. And so to me, this is kind of the theory that I'm sort of basing this entire project off of. And just for the sake of time, I sort of want to kind of explain how I'm hoping to sort of study this phenomenon and try to get some meaningful answers to this question, or hopefully confirm this sort of hypothesis of, you know, organizations as these sort of racialized organisms and anatomical structures. So I'm really theorizing some methodological questions, and I'd be open to any sort of questions or suggestions. But as of right now, I'm really leaning towards thinking of like a experimental method or experimental study design where I sort of give people of different backgrounds sort of small vignettes that explain a different organization or a different company. And depending on the person, the only key difference that will be changed is the CEO will be a black woman, or, you know, maybe the janitors will be all white women, or people working on the oil rigs will be all white women, or people working in HR will be all men. Things like this, sort of like changing the variation within these small vignettes as people read them, and sort of after they read these vignettes, sort of asking questions of like, how effective do you think this organization is? You know, how do you think that there are ways that this organization can be improved? Like, what do you think are some concerns that you might have of this organization's efficacy? What are some issues that you think they might run into? Questions like this. And I'm really hoping that this sort of like gives insight into kind of this larger question of like, what is the anti-DEI sort of movement? Because on the one hand, yes, it is true, it's very plainly, clearly anti-Black racism, but I think we can even take it a step further and sort of like really peel back these layers of this racism to try to get at like, what is the logic that's sort of embedded within that? So I definitely want to stop there because I think that the others have incredible presentations, but I just want to thank everyone for your time and your attention. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right, Mike.
Oh yes, the next person up is Dr. Leah Gaines. Whenever she's ready, she can introduce herself however way she wishes.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
Oh, whoops. Hold on one. Do you all see my presentation?
Yes.
All right, cool. Let me just hit slideshow somewhere around here. All right. You can see the first screen, the first slide. All right, perfect. So my name is Leah Tennant Gaines. I'm an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Bloomfield College of Montclair State University. The title of my presentation is Remembering the Black English Case, African American Language, Critical Race Theory, and the Need for Linguistic Justice. So just a little bit of background to the case. The Black English case centered on the experiences of 11 Black elementary school students, the plaintiffs, who were enrolled at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School in the Ann Arbor, Michigan School District, which was the defendant. The students communicated in African American language, while the dominant linguistic culture of the school privileged the language of wider communication, which is often labeled as academic English, standard English, or white English. These students were inaccurately classified as having learning disabilities and had been placed in a special education class, not due to cognitive impairments, but because of the language that they spoke. The parents argued that their African American language speaking students were inadequately supported by the school system due to linguistic bias. And this lack of institutional support contributed to disparities in literacy development, with African American language speaking students falling behind their language of wider communication speaking peers in reading and writing. In response, parents advocated for instructional strategies that would help their children transition from African American language to the language of wider communication, which would allow their students to meet academic benchmarks and perform well on standardized assessments. The case was filed in 1975, and approximately 4 years later, in 1979, the presiding judge ruled that the school district had failed to adequately support Black English-speaking students. The court found that many teachers had neither acknowledged nor attempted to understand the students' linguistic backgrounds, which constituted a violation of the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974. In response, the district implemented teacher training programs to introduce faculty to African American language and equip them with strategies to support students' transition to language of wider communication. So when I interviewed the lawyer, Gabe Kamowitz, he believed that this case would be solidified in history next to the Brown versus Board of Education, or as he said, this would be a case that was equivalent to the Brown versus Board of Education case.
From that meeting, I developed a theory that we could develop a case that was equivalent to Brown versus Board of Education in the area of class. That is, Brown is obviously related to trying to level the playing field with regard to race, but does not touch the issue of class.
Okay.
I would touch one more point, and then I'll conclude. Sorry, I'm
I'm listening.
Okay. Anyway, to make the point, the Black English count was only one of what I would call 6 counts, and therefore the structure of the case was designed to address the class problem, not just the language problem.
So you'll see Gabe on the left in the 70s and then Gabe on the right today. So this presentation seeks to reintroduce Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School Children versus Ann Arbor School District of 1979 into public and scholarly consciousness by foregrounding the memories of those who participated in or were affected by the case commonly referred to as the Black English case or the Ann Arbor decision. The following questions guide this work. How do oral histories from participants in the Ann Arbor decision reflect experiences of racialized and linguistic discrimination in education? And what are the implications of these memories for understanding systemic racism, linguistic justice, and educational equity today? So, data collection and participants. In 2016, I was enrolled in a graduate level comparative education course that focused on the history of Black and Brown schooling in the United States. The culminating assignment for the course was a collaborative oral history project centered on Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School Children versus Ann Arbor School District. As part of this assignment, we were tasked with interviewing individuals directly involved with the case. I conducted an interview with Gabe Kamowitz, the lead attorney representing the students. Other students in the course interviewed additional key figures such as Ruth Z. and Kylie Brennan. Selected interviews from the oral history project were published on a publicly accessible website. And in 2021, I revisited these oral history interviews with my research assistant. The current study draws on the previously recorded oral history interviews with Gabe Kamowitz, Ruth Z., and Kylie Brennan, each of whom was asked to reflect on their memories of the case. Gabe Kamowitz, whom I interviewed, served as a lead counsel for the plaintiffs, the students at the Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, while working for Michigan Legal Services, where he specialized in education law. Ruth Z. Was a longtime Ann Arbor resident. She was the executive director of the Student Advocacy Center and a vocal supporter of the students during the case, and she recently passed away in 2025. At the time of the interviews, Ruth maintained a close relationship with one of the plaintiffs, Kylie Brennan, who was a student at the Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School and a speaker of African American language at the time that the case was tried. So this research centers CRT, critical race theory, which provides a foundational lens for understanding the intersecting forms of oppression that shape the educational experiences of students involved in the case. Central to CRT is the concept of intersectionality, which is the idea that individuals experience the world through the intersection of multiple overlapping identities such as race, class, language, and perceived ability. In this case, the plaintiffs were Black children from working class families. These students also spoke an African American language, a linguistic tradition that is frequently stigmatized and dismissed by dominant cultural norms. And compounding these factors, the students were perceived by their teachers as lacking intelligence or academic potential, resulting in inadequate instruction and misplacement into special education programs. Viewed through a CRT lens, these students occupied multiple marginalized positions. They were Black, economically disadvantaged, speakers of a stigmatized language, and labeled as intellectually deficient. Their identities stood in stark contrast to the dominant norms of their middle-class white neighborhood school, which privileged speakers of the language of wider communication. These intersecting identities shaped not only how the students experienced schooling, but also how they were treated by the educators and the institution itself. So the first finding was memory of racialized treatment. So one of the central themes that emerged from this research is Kylie Brennan's memory of racialized treatment at his school.
Being in class, raising my hand, because, we were underestimated as African Americans, as Black people, Black kids. I knew the same things, and I took in and absorbed the teaching just like everybody else in the classroom did. But when I raised my hand to answer the question, I'm not sure if it was a fear from the teacher of me getting it wrong or just embarrassment. I totally do not know what was going on, but I can't recall one time that the teacher chose me to answer the question. I can remember sitting in the back of the class, I had an afro back in the 70s, it was an afro, which a lot of things has now came back into play because, there was some great times. So I can remember being in back of the class, didn't get chosen to answer the question. I can remember the students not talking to me, and I'm thinking it was a result of the teacher shunning me away, and the kids actually shunned me away because what they seen from the teacher, because they're role models. And it just sort of wore off on my fellow students. But I can remember being teased after a while. I can just remember not wanting to go back to the school. I can remember the straw that broke the camel's back. The teacher, she hit me. And that's what really catapulted everything into play. I was playing, I threw a rock, but I didn't throw it at a car. I didn't throw it at a house. I didn't throw it at
a child.
Anybody. I just threw a rock. Kids see a rock, pick it up and throw it. She pulled over. I'm like, oh, okay, here come my teacher, what's going on? She grabbed me. Don't ever throw rocks, and hit me 3 times on the butt. I was like, no, she didn't. No, this white lady didn't just do this to me. And it shocked me. It was a total shock to my system. I ran all the way home crying.
So Kylie remembers spatial segregation in the back of the classroom, microaggressions of not being chosen with his hand raised, eager to participate, and physical punishment that left an emotional scar. So another theme is the memory of society. Oh, I'm sorry, is the discrimination against language or race. So a reoccurring theme across the oral history interviews was the ambiguity surrounding the source of the student's unequal treatment. So was the unequal treatment rooted in racial prejudice, linguistic bias, or both? Participants frequently questioned whether the discrimination experienced by the students stemmed from their racial identity or from their use of African American language.
We were acting on behalf of poor children. I think we may have played a game and tried not to mention race, but at any rate, we said that these children were markedly different from the other children who attended the school because they did not have the resources. This is where it starts to link up with the equal protection argument. We argued that the children.
But Black English was, discrimination on the basis of language was thrown in by a student attorney, I believe, at Michigan Legal Services, patterning after the Lau decision in California, which claimed discrimination on the basis of language with the Chinese children.
Now, it actually resulted in a language barrier. That's what they said, but it was just clearly racism, you know, and that was obvious to everybody, even the judge, even the teachers, even the students and the parents. They just didn't want to admit to it, you know, and I would have liked to see what had happened if it would have came out the other way. It would have been real interesting.
Yeah, they're
My last day in that school. Yep.
again, I think the designation of Black English has really deflected a lot of what the real issues are. So it's hard to kind of get at the, you know, just this dismissal of.
So the line between linguistic and racial discrimination is often thin and difficult to distinguish. Contemporary scholarship argues that language-based discrimination against Black students is frequently a proxy for racial bias. In this case, the students were Black children in predominantly white schools, spoke a non-academic language, and was neither accepted nor supported by their peers. And the teachers' actions reflected not only linguistic bias, but also anti-Black sentiment, a phenomenon that April Baker Bell refers to as anti-Black linguistic racism. And I think
We were acting on behalf of.
so for time, I'm not going to play these clips, but essentially what they talk about is the societal backlash. So after the case, basically the public responded in backlash. So they were kind of disgusted that these students would even bring up that these students would, or their parents would do such a thing, meaning they would see it as these people should just be happy to be here. How dare they complain, essentially.
Anyway.
So some of the racialized trauma and limits of legal victories. So despite formal access to integrated schooling, Black students are frequently denied the resources, affirmation, and culturally responsive instruction necessary for academic success. Instead, educators sometimes adopt deficit-based perspectives, viewing students as inherently lacking rather than interrogating institutional failures. The Ann Arbor decision reveals a specific form of racialized trauma, what Baker Bell refers to as anti-Black linguistic racism. This form of discrimination targets not only the racial identity of Black students, but also the language varieties that they speak. It manifests into classroom practices, disciplinary actions, and curricular exclusions, reinforcing the notion that Blackness and Black speech are incompatible with academic success. Legal victories alone cannot transform educational institutions without sustained investment in culturally affirming pedagogies, teacher preparation, and policy reform. Black students will continue to bear the burden of institutional neglect. And just in conclusion, this research underscores the importance of oral histories in preserving and amplifying marginalized narratives. The Ann Arbor decision has largely faded from public memory, or worse, has been reduced to deficit-based characters and dismissive jokes about Ebonics. Nearly 50 years later, this case must be recentered in public discourse, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of the enduring struggles for linguistic and racial justice. Educator training must be revisited and reimagined. Schools must be required to recognize and affirm the linguistic identities of African American language speaking students, and policies must be implemented that move beyond superficial diversity efforts and toward meaningful, sustained change. Thank you.
Right. Good job. And Mike, who you have?
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. We got one more. The next person is Marcus Shields. You can introduce yourself however way you want to.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Marcus Shields. I come to you by way of the University of Edinburgh, across the pond. My specialty is New Testament and early Christian literature, specializing in the Pauline corpus and cultural hermeneutics. We're giving you a presentation today from a paper that I've been working on entitled Rumor as White Gaze, How Distorted Perception Misreads Jesus and Black Bodies in Political Context. In conversation with our panel's exploration of the fear of Black consciousness, the marker narrative theorizes or thematizes distorted perception of Jesus through the circulation of rumor, and this dynamic is analytically comparable, though not identical, to the racialized misreading of Black bodies within modern political context. Using George Yancey's hermeneutic of the white gaze, this paper argues that rumor in Mark's presentation of Jesus is a narrative mechanism that normalizes misinterpretation of Jesus, just as racialized rumor and stereotype shape the white gaze's misreading of Black bodies. Thus, both contexts, both ancient and modern, reveal how misrecognition becomes politically consequential for marginalized bodies. We'll now move to rumor, perception, and misrecognition. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is presented as a Jewish body that is perceived not because of what he says or what he does, but what is said about him in three different Mark and narrative spaces. This is evidence in Mark 1:28, 3:22, 6:14 through 16, and 15:35 through 36. Demonstrating that rumors are not background noise, but the narrative engine that constructs a distorted Jesus. Perception or public perception does not begin with a direct encounter, rather it is shaped by ways of seeing the subject before seeing the subject. In various Markan episodes, the Jewish juggernaut enters public consciousness not through theological reflection, but through the whirlwind of unverified reports about his identity, power, and intentions. These rumors spreading immediately and everywhere create a climate for his marginalized body to be misrecognized. That is, the Messiah is interpreted through expectations, fears, anxieties, rather than his enfleshed presence. Again, rumor becomes the narrative force that skews Jesus before he can speak for himself. In a similar dynamic, this is present in the operation of racial politics, where Black bodies are read through the distorted lens of what George Yancey calls the white gaze. According to Yancey, the white gaze is to be seen as a threat, that is the mise en scène, by placing a Black body at the center of the white eye gate, which is trying to make sense or decipher what they do not understand in the parameters of white world making. The white gaze is not only an act of looking, it is a socially constructed framework that perceives, encounters, and maneuvers Black bodies as objects of fear, fetish, and fantasy. Like rumor and Mark, the white gaze has a functionality that is a pre-interpretive system that shapes what is seen, what is assumed, and what is feared before any contact is initiated. Therefore, in both ancient and modern contexts, perception is not neutral. It is structured by noise pollution that floods the Oriel and travels to the Port Perel for diaspora performance. While the historical and cultural contexts differ, both systems reveal how marginalized bodies, Jesus and Mark's narrative, and Black bodies in the modern political life are misread through rumor and white gaze. Rumor in Mark's rendition of Jesus' story is politically threatening to the Roman establishment because he presents a religiously ambivalent stance and a social destabilization. Likewise, racialized rumor constructs Black bodies as criminal, hypervisible, and dangerous in political discourse. Now note that in both cases, misrecognition is not accidental. It is produced, circulated, and normalized to render the fear of Black consciousness Placing mark and rumor in dialogue with Yancey's white gaze demonstrates how distorted perception becomes a mechanism for social control. So rumor authorizes fear, legitimizes misreading, and produces a world where marginalized bodies must navigate imposed on them by others or white interpretation of the Black body. Ultimately, this comparative lens highlights the ethical stakes of perception. Thus, to misread a minoritized body is to mislocate its humanity and truth. Let's move on to rumor and antiquity. Rumor and antiquity function as a political force, a mechanism of social control, and a technology of perception that shaped how bodies, movements, and events were interpreted. Classical historians and New Testament scholars note that rumor, whether it's termed pheme, akue, or logos, operated as a form of a collection of speech without a stable origin, circulating authoritatively and rapidly in the absence of verified information. Although rumor is examined from various contexts, it would be advantageous to examine it in three areas, namely as one, uncontrolled speech, political force, and New Testament scholarship. Ancient writers frequently describe rumors as a self-propelling communicative force. Livy suggests that rumor is a phenomenon that grows by its own movement, which expands as it travels by air. Tacitus portrays rumor as a destabilizing agent that spreads fear, suspicion, and political anxiety. These ancient authors emphasize three important features that is vital to understanding rumor. First, there is a lack of origin. It has no identifiable source with which may increase its authority. Second, there's a rapid circulation. Rumor moves faster than official communication. Third, rumor gains credibility through repetition rather than evidence, concluding that it is a social dynamic that produces a social event of confusion. As a political force, rumor often functioned as a political instrument. It fashioned public opinion, influenced imperial succession, and generated fear around perceived threats. This was a very powerful tool because rumor could incite violence, destabilize rulers, and justify a state of action. Yes, rumor was dangerous and useful. For those in power, of course, we know it was dangerous. For those seeking to manipulate perception, it was rather effective. The insight for rumor is crucial for understanding Mark's narrative about Jesus because it becomes a matter of public speculation that had political consequences. Rumor constructs Jesus as a figure who threatens the Roman imperial power. Thus, Jesus was not seen as the equalizer, shout out to Denzel Washington, but the destabilizing savior. New Testament scholars such as Joel Marcus and Richard Burridge highlight rumor as a narrative device in Mark's gospel. They both note that the Markan evangelist foregrounds hearsay rather than facts or eyewitness testimony. People in the text respond to reports about Jesus rather than Jesus himself. And rumor creates a gap between Jesus' identity and public perception. So let's move on to rumor as force or narrative force. Mark's gospel habitually presents Jesus as a figure whose identity materialized through rumor rather than in his enfleshed encounter. The first reference appears in 128, where Jesus' fame spreads throughout Galilee. The term akai, which means report or what is heard, signals that public knowledge of Jesus is constructed through circulating speech. This kind of circulation intensifies in 6:14 through 16, when Herod interprets Jesus entirely through political rumor through the following quotes. And it reads, John has been raised. He is Elijah. He is a prophet, unmasking how inherited stories or narratives shape perception before encounter. In 322, scribes deploy rumor as accusation, reframing Jesus' liberative work as demonic activity, a strategy of social control that anticipates later charges at his trial. Further, even at the cross in 1535 to 36, Jesus' painful utterance is misheard and misinterpreted through pre-existing expectations. Across three narratives, or across these narratives, rumor functions as a preconceived notion that produces misrecognition. Mark's story establishes a pattern in which Jesus is seen through stories others tell about him, a dynamic structurally parallel to modern forms of racialized rumor described by Yancey. Let's move on to reading rumor through Yancey's phenomenology of white gaze. This paper employs George Yancey's phenomenology of the white gaze as its primary methodological lens for interpreting how rumor functions as a mechanism of misrecognition and Marx's interpretation of Jesus. Yancey argues that white gaze is not just looking, and it's not just a quick look, but a racialized pre-interpretive structure that positions Black bodies within the field of suspicion and distortion. The gaze precedes encounter. It shapes perception before any interaction occurs. The pre-encounter, the meaning making provides a conceptual bridge to this gospel where Jesus is repeatedly interpreted through circulating reports rather than a first-hand account. I'm trying to hold on. Within Yancey's account of the white gaze, rumor functions as a racialized interpretive paradigm that harms the Black body by determining its meaning prematurely. Yes, Yancey argues that white gaze is a socially inherited horizon of expectation that precedes encounter. Fixing the Black body in white discourse produces a narrative of danger before it appears. Rumor is one of the primary avenues that horizon is produced. It circulates racialized stories that become etched in the minds of the ones, or the colonizers who supplied the categories through which the Black body is read, i.e., there are no close readings of the Black body, only assumptions that lead to harm or demise. In this sense, rumor does not merely misinform, it pre-interprets, projecting meaning onto the Black body that generates what Yancey calls the ontological vulnerability, a condition in which the body is exposed to heightened scrutiny, surveillance, and political harm. These robust dynamic parallels the function of rumor in Mark's gospel, where Jesus is repeatedly encountered through circulating reports that determine how he was seen or understood. In both contexts, ancient and modern, rumor operates as a gaze-shaping force, constructing a world in which a body, whether Black, Jewish, or minoritized, is already known, is already judged, and is already positioned within a narrative of which he or she is not the author. Reading Mark through Yancey's white gaze suggests that rumor in this gospel functions as a gaze-shaping structure which grants a lens of distortion. Yancey argues that the white gaze harms the Black body by fixing it within spaces of suspicion, danger, and deficiency before encounter ever happens. Rumor operates similarly in Mark, that is, it supplies the categories through which Jesus is seen, determining his meaning in advance and constraining how he can be recognized. Herod's political fear, the scribes' accusatory framing, and the crowd's mishearing at the cross all reveal that Jesus is met with through stories about him rather than direct knowledge. So, like Jesus undergoes judgment through rumor, Black bodies under white gaze becomes vulnerable to distortion and misunderstanding because of inherited stories that are passed down. Attending to how rumors shape perception in Mark invites the individual to reflect on the interpretive responsibilities we bear in our own context. It's very simple. The ethical implication is clear. Close reading, whether a text or the human document, requires resisting the power of rumor and white gaze, attending instead to the presence, voice, and reality of the encounter, and not interpreting the rumor as a Black body of disgust. Thank you.
All right. Good. That shows some love and appreciation for this panel. I always want to shout out Michael Royster for bringing some good panels to these sessions. He's the one that kind of navigated and put all of this together. So we have, I think, roughly about 15 minutes again for Q&A. So comments, questions? Not everybody at once. I can't handle all that at one time. Oh my God, so many questions. Oh my God.
Well, I'm just going to function as just a discussant for the panel. These aren't questions or anything like here, but the common theme here today is different responses to a fear of Black consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just as a discussant here. Now, these aren't questions or answers, but it's just something to think about. This sounds a little cliche-ish, but I think many of us have enough education and life experience to know that, quote unquote, knowledge is power. And so one of the challenges that a population has to address is how does one deal with disempowerment, and which comes with disenfranchisement, by controlling a population through ideas and information, and that's even before we get to practice. So let me give an example. So I'm gonna just point out two institutions in the United States. And that's even before we even get to even religion and so forth, just two main ones. And of course, all of them have religious implications. Let's start with politics. Collectively, at least in the 20th century and the beginning part of the 21st century, Black Americans have figured out ways to somewhat get ahead through the democratic process. So if Black Americans have figured out how to get ahead through the democratic process, then the response is to simply destroy democracy altogether, since the democratic process functions as a means for Blacks to get ahead. Now, beginning with the 19th century, Blacks have figured out how to get ahead through education. And so the response to Blacks getting ahead through education is destroy education altogether, from pre-K through higher education. It's just destroy the entire institution. Attack it, maybe not all at once, but just do it gradually. And that's sort of what we're witnessing now. Now, and how is that even being possible? Easily. Is it possible that a significant portion of the population is unable to, or actually has a lack of grasp of the present, not able to see what's happening? And one of the antidotes to being able to grasp the present is to have a better grasp of how did we get here. And that's where everything from not only recent events, but also but the rest of the knowledge that people in positions of power don't want us to have. Keeping it quiet and hidden. Whether it's directly through institutions or very broad and subtle through propaganda. And then also, let me tie in the Bible. Well, guess what? Because we have a biblical scholar here. And likewise, there is also wisdom that could be acquired from a close reading of ancient texts that can help better inform populations across the globe about how to interpret the present. And so, now, why is it still important today? If nothing else, survival. Overcoming the existential threats. And the existential threats that appears to attack one group, I'm gonna use something. I'm gonna use this expression out of context, but I hope you get where I'm getting at. What affects one group directly, this is not my own words, affects everybody indirectly, right? Okay, where have I seen that before? MLK. So, and so one thing I would like to tie in and is, or maybe perhaps recommend, is an article by Tara Yoso, Tara, or something like that. Yoso, Yosso. It was written roughly in the early 2000s. I like to say 2003 or 4. And you're going to just go straight to the section. It's called Whose Culture Has Capital or something like that. And there's 4 areas to look at that sort of takes a different turn on all 4 of us. One is aspirational capital. Make sure that amid what is happening or has happened or that not just young people, but people of all ages still continue to aspire rather than just simply concede to apathy. Something else that's also in there is something called navigational capital. This has been going on since the earliest of days. Opposition of all types and all sorts. Now opposition is high tech. Institutions are more complex and opposition is high tech. How to navigate amid all these different institutional attacks that pose existential threats. And likewise, also in that same article is cultural capital, and another huge one that we heard Dr. Gaines mention earlier. I'm just going to refer to you all in that same section is also linguistic capital. All right, so this is a recommended article to check out that sort of also complements what each of us panelists have had. So now I want to open the floor for anyone else. It could be questions or comments for any one of us.
Let me ask Cody something. And there are some comments. I see Reginald Bell is dropping in comments in the chat. So please take some time to look at that as well. Cody, I believe at the end you were talking about the DEI, of course, being anti-Black, but it was another, but you would say you want to go deeper than that. I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of expound on what it, because you got to the end and, I know you was, worried about your time, but what is the other part we need to be concerned about or looking at?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think that oftentimes, at least this is in my personal experience, and I'd be curious to hear what others sort of think, but
Yeah.
especially in the field of sociology, like there are some fantastic race ethnicity scholars within the field of sociology that do so much work to sort of point out all of the various sort of tentacles of racism, right? And the various manifestations in which it takes place and how it impacts certain people's lives. And I think studying the impact, I think, is incredibly vital. And I'm incredibly glad that they sort of laid the groundwork for me to sort of understand the various ways that racism, particularly anti-Black racism, sort of manifests in its various sort of ways that it does in our society. For me in particular, what I think would be interesting in terms of, at least on a theoretical point, in terms of pushing scholars who study race and study racism, is to sort of think about, instead of concluding with the premise of this is racism, I think we could take it a step further and say, this is racism because racists think like this, like this, like this. The histories are built on this, on this, on this. Like, what are the sort of what are the mental mechanisms that are sort of at play? What are the histories that are sort of informing a regular everyday person in society that sort of produces a sort of like racist disposition, right? So
Mhm.
you can study the effects and you can study the person who is sort of performing racism, but I'm really interested in like what's the logic, right? The quote unquote logic behind the sort of racism, if there is such a thing. So that's really what I'm hoping to sort of like capture, like really just like push the conversation maybe just like a little bit further instead of just saying like this is what racism is. Say like this is racism because such and such and such.
Okay, great. All right. All right. Anyone else have a question or comment? Because if not, I can keep going.
I thought all the presentations were phenomenal. And I guess I'm kind of stuck in that we're here again.
Yeah.
And I guess the question that I have is, in studying this, how can we move to some action? So it's for each presenter.
Can you
Okay, this makes okay. Somebody who was that?
Oh no, I was just
Yeah.
asking, can she state the question one more time? You said the action.
Yes, like what is our action to move forward? So like with the Black English, how can we be more attuned to what's going on, perhaps even in our own classrooms, but even in our community? How can we fight against what's happening?
Right.
I think the first things are to one, validate students in their language, right? Teach them about language diversity, not just African American language, but that English in itself is very diverse, right? So when I studied abroad in Trinidad and Tobago as an undergraduate, their English is different. They still speak English. It doesn't make it less valuable. It doesn't make it inaccurate. It's just a different
We
type of
know
English.
exactly what she talked about.
Exactly. So you know what I'm saying, right? And I think that we have to get students to understand that, as well as it's really hard to change societal beliefs, but education helps, right? Educating people on difference, variance, those types of things. Now, I don't know the right or wrong answer here. Even linguists, they differ in their approach to this. Some people say that teaching students the transition, so affirming African American language, but also teaching them how to communicate in the language of wider communication will help them in terms of not being discriminated against on language, right? But some people say that teaching them that or teaching them code switching is teaching them that their language is not valuable or that it should not be a language they should communicate in. So I don't have the right answer there, right? But I think also giving the students the knowledge, right? So telling them you are welcome to outside of this classroom speak in whatever language you want to, but know that some people might use it against you, right? And then let them decide what it is that they would like to do. So give them the tools to be able to do both. And if they don't want to do both, that's up to them, right? So I think giving people education and choice is important.
Yeah. I want
I
to give.
put a couple of I put a couple of items in the chat. So I just basically said in the first, for starters, for using if we're looking at the democratic process, don't completely throw that one out either. But use the democratic process to vote in all of the state elections and all the local elections, everything down to city council, to the yes or no questions, to school boards, um, as well as the national elections, because there's a lot of people who just might vote once every 4 years and skip all the so for example, if policing is a problem to some people, well, guess what? The mayor is the one that appoints the police chief. You know what I mean? A lot of judges are, some judges are appointed, but many of them are elected. Now, another one is also, I put in there, media literacy skills, because there's a significant portion of the population that cannot grasp or comprehend media bias. They can't even see it. So that's just for starters.
And
I think I could. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Johnson.
I was going to ask you a question, Marcus, but go ahead. You make a
Okay.
comment.
So yes, I appreciate the question. I think it's three things that we need to do if you want to inspire into action. There are three things that I usually do that spurs me to action. The first thing I do is I make an assessment. Do I really understand the situation at hand? Because a lot of times that we could be on these panels, we can present papers, we can present projects, but do we really make the right assessment? Do I really understand what's going on at hand? That's one thing. That's number one. Once I make the assessment, then I want to move to the intervention. So once I move to the intervention, that's going to inspire me to action, but it depends on what kind of intervention can I make. And once I do that, what is the proper outcome after I do that? So I call it the AIO. So when you do things of that nature, that's going to inspire you, especially if you're participating with groups and having colleagues in collaboration, because you and I need to talk. We need to see if your assessment is what I see. What kind of intervention are you going to do? Because what you're going to do, Jacqueline, may not be the same as what I'm going to do, but it's still an intervention. And then let us understand, what is my outcome? What am I projecting? What am I saying? What is the result going to be? And so one of the books that frames this quite perfectly is Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Community and Chaos. He has that perfect model of assessing the situation. He assesses it with Stokely Carmichael. He assesses it with Floyd McKissick and all those other brothers and sisters that are in the mix. And then they come up with an outcome. So if you go to the end of the book, you'll see what his outcome would be as far as the government, right? But they never capitalize on it. Not them, but the bigger context at large. So those are the things that I would think about as we try to be called to action. Dr. Johnson, you had a question for me?
Well, we're at the end now. I think you wrapped it up. I was gonna I was just gonna make mention, comment question about rumor and how is that connected to what we understand now of misinformation and disinformation in today's politics.
Okay, so I can answer that real quick, brother. Real quick, Dr. Johnson. I appreciate you having us on. You want to overcome rumor, brothers and sisters? I would advise us to do two things. One, consider hermeneutics, and that's simply just to decipher, to understand. And then number two, can we start doing a close reading of everything? Because we're in a society now that we run through things so fast and so quickly that we don't slow down to really close read a subject matter, close read a person, or close read a circumstance. So if we can do just that, I think, Dr. Johnson, that'll put us in the right spot. Does that answer your question?
Oh, that's good. That's good. Show some love for this panel. Our last panel for the pre-conference of the Philosophy and Communication Conference here at Duquesne University. I want to thank all of you for participating.